My name is Darius Quinn. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I have been described with the same word, steady. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work in commercial risk consulting, contracts, liabilities, long-term exposure assessments. My job is to anticipate instability before it becomes visible. I study patterns. I notice small imbalances. I calculate outcomes most people don't see until they're already inside them. To most people, I appear calm, reserved, hard to read. In my family, that translated into something slightly different. It meant I was the one who didn't need much, the one who would figure it out, the reliable son. My younger brother was different, charismatic, expressive, magnetic in ways I never tried to be. When he struggled, it drew attention. When he succeeded, it drew celebration. When I succeeded, it drew relief. We weren't compared out loud, not directly, but roles form quietly in families. And once they're assigned, they're rarely questioned. This story isn't about rage. It isn't about revenge. There's no dramatic explosion or emotional breakdown waiting somewhere in the middle. It's about structure. It's about what happens when emotional favoritism quietly intersects with financial reality. Years ago, my parents transferred my college fund to my younger brother without asking me. They framed it as temporary help, as family support, as something I wouldn't mind because I was doing fine. At the same time, I was paying $12,000 a month for the mortgage on the house they lived in, a house legally titled under my name. That arrangement had started as a practical solution. It ended as a test of something deeper. What you'll hear isn't a story of confrontation fueled by anger. It's the slow recognition of a pattern, the quiet documentation of imbalance. The moment I understood that generosity without boundaries becomes an expectation and eventually entitlement. There's a sentence that sits at the center of everything that follows. Favoritism doesn't override ownership. I didn't shout it. I didn't post it online. I simply lived by it. This is a story about invisible roles, about the cost of being the dependable one, about the difference between love and leverage, and about what changes when you decide to stop absorbing weight that was never evenly distributed. Before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. Have you ever been the one everyone depended on without ever being fully seen? In my family, I was never the dramatic one. I was the stable one. That sounds like praise, and for a long time, I accepted it that way. Stability implies strength. It implies reliability. It implies maturity. But stability also implies something else. It implies you don't require maintenance. My younger brother Evan was the opposite of me in all the ways that draw attention. He was expressive, spontaneous, quick to speak, and quicker to feel. If something bothered him, everyone knew. If he achieved something, it was celebrated loudly. When I achieved something, it was acknowledged with a nod. That's great, Darius. We knew you would. Relief, not excitement. I graduated near the top of my class. I secured internships without asking for help. I built professional momentum early. When tuition became a concern, I earned scholarships. My parents often told relatives, Darius has always taken care of himself. It sounded like admiration. Over time, I realized it was an expectation. Evan struggled more visibly. He changed majors twice. He needed tutoring. He needed encouragement. He needed reassurance. And my parents gave it to him. That in itself wasn't wrong. Different children need different things. I understood that. I still do. But understanding something intellectually doesn't erase how it feels emotionally. There's a subtle shift that happens when one child is supported and another is assumed to be self-sustaining. The support becomes nurturing. The assumption becomes identity. I became the low-maintenance son, the dependable one, the one who didn't need backup. When my parents bought a large house outside the city years ago, it was aspirational, a symbol of arrival. But markets shift, interest rates climb, expenses compound. Eventually, their mortgage adjusted to nearly $12,000 a month. It wasn't sustainable long term. I had just received a significant promotion at my firm. My income qualified for refinancing at better terms. The solution presented itself as practical. Darius, my father said carefully, if we refinance under your name, it stabilizes everything, just until things balance out. Stabilizes everything. That phrase followed me my entire life. The house would transfer into my name. I would assume the mortgage. They would contribute what they could. It wasn't positioned as a sacrifice. It was positioned as teamwork. And I agreed, not because I was pressured, but because that was who I had always been to them. Reliable, useful, capable, invisible. At family gatherings, my father would gesture around the living room and say, "We love our home." I never corrected him, even though the title bore my name, even though the liability was entirely mine. Every month, $12,000 left my account, without fail. I never mentioned it. I never used it as leverage. I never framed it as generosity. It was simply what needed to be done. That's how I saw it. But slowly, without noticing, the role solidified. Evan wasn't expected to contribute. My parents weren't expected to adjust their lifestyle immediately. And I wasn't expected to question the imbalance because I was stable. And stable things don't complain. They absorb. They endure. They hold until one day they don't. The first cut didn't look like betrayal. It looked like logistics. At the time, Evan was midway through his second attempt at finishing college. He had changed majors again, this time to something he described as aligned with his real passions. My parents said, growth isn't linear. They said, exploration is important. I agreed. I always agreed. One Sunday afternoon, I was at the house, reviewing some refinancing paperwork. My father was at the dining table, glasses low on his nose, scanning numbers. My mother was in the kitchen, speaking softly to Evan about a tuition deadline. There was tension in her voice, not panic, but urgency. I didn't think much of it until I overheard a sentence that felt almost casual. "We can use Darius's reserve," she said quietly. There was no dramatic pause after it, no whisper of secrecy, just a practical tone. My father responded, "He won't mind. He barely touched it." They were referring to my college fund, the account they had opened when I was 17, the one I rarely used because scholarships covered most of my tuition, the one they told me they were keeping intact for grad school if you ever want it. I stepped into the room. "Use what?" I asked, not accusing, just clarifying. My mother turned, slightly startled, but not defensive. "Your education reserve," she said gently. "Evan's tuition gap is temporary. We'll replenish it." The word we felt flexible. My father added, "You're doing well. This is just short-term balancing." Balancing. There it was again. The language of stability. I remember nodding slowly, not because I fully agreed, but because objecting would have required shifting out of the role I'd occupied for decades. And roles are comfortable, even when they're limiting. "It's fine," I said. That was the first small cut. Not the transfer itself, but the assumption, the absence of a conversation before the decision. I told myself it made sense. Families redistribute resources all the time. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't secretive. It was simply expected. Expected that I would be okay with it. Expected that my future plans were flexible. expected that my security was surplus. Later that evening, Evan found me on the back patio. "Thanks, man," he said. "I know you don't care about that stuff, but it helps." "I don't care about that stuff." Money, planning, long-term positioning. The things I built my career around. I smiled slightly. "Just make it count," I replied. He laughed. Of course. The conversation ended there, but something subtle lodged in me. Not anger, not resentment, just awareness. I began noticing language more carefully after that. Whenever finances were discussed, my contributions were framed as background support. Evan's needs were framed as an active priority. When I paid the mortgage each month, it was routine. When Evan made even a partial tuition payment from a part-time job, it was celebrated. "Look at him taking responsibility," my mother would say proudly. I didn't correct that either, because technically she wasn't wrong. But responsibility, I was beginning to understand, is often measured relative to expectation. Evan was praised for stepping forward. I was expected to hold steady, and expectations, when unspoken, are the hardest to challenge. The reserve fund transfer happened a few weeks later. I saw the notification in my account, $42,000 withdrawn. Temporary, they'd said, replenished eventually. I closed the app without comment. Externally, nothing changed. Internally, a small recalibration occurred. It wasn't about the money, it was about realization. I wasn't being consulted, I was being allocated. And the difference between those two things is subtle until it isn't. The problem with subtle disrespect is that it rarely arrives in a form dramatic enough to confront. It comes disguised as convenience, as family shorthand, as "you understand, right?" After the first withdrawal from my education reserve, no one mentioned it again. There was no formal update, no follow-up discussion about repayment. It simply folded into the background of family life, like it had always been meant to happen. At dinners, Evan spoke confidently about new plans, business ideas, partnerships, potential investors. My parents listened with encouragement that felt almost protective. When I asked measured questions about cash flow, about risk exposure, my tone was interpreted as skepticism. "You're always so serious," my mother would say lightly, as if caution were a personality flaw. I learned to soften my questions. Then I learned to stop asking them. The second withdrawal happened 3 months later. Smaller amount, $18,000. I didn't hear it discussed beforehand. I saw it afterward. Again, I said nothing, not because I approved, but by then, silence felt easier than resistance. Silence preserves harmony. Resistance disrupts narrative. And the narrative was clear. Evan needed runway. I was stable enough to provide it. One evening, during a family gathering, an aunt asked how the house situation was going. My father smiled proudly. "We're lucky Darius stepped in," he said. "It worked out perfectly." Worked out. As if it had resolved itself. As if I weren't wiring $12,000 every month to maintain it. My aunt turned to me. "That's so generous of you." I nodded politely. "It's temporary," my mother added quickly, but her tone didn't sound temporary. It sounded settled. Later that night, I reviewed the mortgage amortization schedule. Alone, in my apartment, I recalculated timelines. I looked at equity projections. I analyzed appreciation trends in the Portland market. It wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. The pattern wasn't loud, but it was consistent. Evan's needs were dynamic and visible. Mine were static and assumed. At one point, I mentioned casually that I was considering a graduate certification program, something strategic for my career. "That's expensive, isn't it?" my father asked. "Possibly," I said. "We should focus on getting Evan stabilized first," my mother added gently. "Then we can think about expansions." Expansions, as if my development were optional growth. as if his stability were urgent infrastructure. I didn't argue. I rationalized. Different timelines, different personalities, different trajectories. That's what I told myself. I reminded myself that I wasn't struggling. I wasn't drowning. I had margin. I had control. And control makes discomfort easier to tolerate. But normalization is powerful. The more something repeats, the less it feels like a choice. It becomes policy, unwritten, unacknowledged, but real. I noticed smaller things too. When Evan missed a rent contribution to my parents one month, it was excused immediately. He's under pressure, my mother said. When I once delayed transferring a reimbursement for property tax by 3 days because of travel, my father texted twice. Everything okay? It wasn't accusatory. It was concerned. Concern, I realized, is often distributed according to perceived fragility. Evan was fragile. I was fortified. So concern flowed in one direction, expectation flowed in the other. The education reserve eventually dropped to nearly half its original balance. Still no formal conversation. Still no written acknowledgement. Still no repayment schedule. Just implied trust. And trust, without structure, becomes assumption. One night, as I reviewed my accounts again, I didn't feel angry. I felt something more unsettling. Predictable. I could forecast the next step. The reserve would likely be exhausted before Evans' ventures stabilized. The mortgage would continue indefinitely, and I would continue absorbing both, unless something changed. But at that stage, I hadn't decided to change anything. I was still rationalizing, still preserving peace, still playing the role assigned to me. Reliable, useful, quiet. Because confronting disrespect means acknowledging it exists. And acknowledging it means accepting that the dynamic isn't accidental. It's patterned. And patterns, once seen clearly, are difficult to unsee. There's a moment in every long pattern where you stop asking whether something is happening and start recognizing that it has been happening all along. For me, it wasn't triggered by a fight. It was triggered by a sentence. We were sitting in the living room after dinner. Evan was explaining a new partnership opportunity, something about scaling a small consulting concept into a digital platform. My parents were listening closely, asking supportive questions. I was half paying attention, scrolling through property tax updates on my phone. At some point, my father said, almost casually, "Darius will help us figure out the structure, not if. Wouldn't you mind? Just certainty." I looked up. "Figure out what structure?" I asked. "For Evan's equity split," he said. "You're good at that stuff. You're good at that stuff." It was meant as praise. But what I heard was an assignment, not an invitation. Assignment. I noticed how the room felt in that moment. No tension, no anticipation. It was simply assumed that I would analyze risk, draft agreements, safeguard projections, without stake, without compensation, without recognition. Because that's what I did. I was infrastructure, reliable, functional, invisible. The realization didn't hurt sharply. It settled slowly like cold air moving under a door. I wasn't the son who needed support. I wasn't the son who inspired emotional urgency. I was the son who stabilized the system. And systems rarely thank their foundations. They just rely on them. Later that week, my mother called me about a minor maintenance issue at the house. Something with the roof flashing after heavy rain. "Can you handle it?" she asked. Of course I could. The house was legally mine. The liability was mine. The insurance was mine. But in conversation, it was always framed as their home and my responsibility. That subtle language difference matters. Ownership was legal. Belonging was emotional. And I occupied only one of those spaces. I began to replay past conversations in my head. How often had I been consulted after decisions were already made? How often had my stability been used to justify reallocation? How often had You don't need it been the silent reasoning behind choices. The role wasn't malicious. It was efficient. Every family unconsciously assigns one member as the regulator, the calm one, the problem solver, the absorber of pressure. That was me. But regulation without consent becomes an obligation. An obligation without acknowledgement becomes erasure. One evening, I reviewed my financial dashboards again: mortgage amortization, education reserve balance, insurance coverage. Numbers don't lie. They don't soften the truth. They don't adjust their tone to protect feelings. They show exposure clearly, and I saw something undeniable. I carried the largest financial liability in the family. I contributed the most capital. I assumed the highest risk. Yet, in emotional hierarchy, I was the least prioritized. That asymmetry didn't explode inside me. It crystallized. I wasn't being overlooked accidentally. I was being relied upon strategically, not in a manipulative way, in a comfortable way. Comfort can be more powerful than intent because comfort resists change. I asked myself a question I had never allowed myself before. If I stopped playing this role, what would happen? The answer wasn't dramatic. It was destabilizing because the system depended on my predictability, my silence, my compliance. And the moment I saw that clearly, something subtle shifted inside me. Not rebellion, not anger, clarity. I had been assigned the role of reliable, but I had never formally agreed to be permanent. And permanence, I realized, is something you must consent to. Otherwise, it becomes quite confined. For the first time, I considered the possibility that the role wasn't fixed. It was chosen, repeatedly, by me, and what's chosen can be unchosen. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen when the second withdrawal cleared. It didn't even happen when my education reserve dipped below half its original balance. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Rain against the windows of my apartment. Coffee is cooling beside my laptop. A quiet inbox. No urgency. I was reviewing my monthly outflows when the mortgage auto debit processed. $12,000. Cleared. I watched the number leave my account the way I had watched it for years, without emotion. Then I opened the property valuation dashboard. The market had risen again. Equity had grown substantially. On paper, it was an asset. In practice, it was leverage I had never exercised. And that was the moment something rearranged internally. Not dramatically, not violently, just a quiet recalibration. I realized I had been treating my financial capacity as communal property, not because anyone demanded it explicitly, but because the role I'd been assigned made it feel natural. I leaned back in my chair and asked myself a simple question. If this house were owned by anyone else, an investor, a colleague, a client, would I advise them to continue this arrangement without written contribution terms? The answer was immediate. No. I would advise documentation, clear boundaries, shared liability, defined expectations. But when it came to my own life, I had substituted structure with sentiment, family, trust, understanding. And while those things matter, they are not systems, they are emotions. The shift wasn't about resentment, it was about congruence. My professional life was governed by contracts. My personal life was governed by assumption, and the two are no longer aligned. That same afternoon, I logged into the Education Reserve account again. Another transfer had been scheduled, pending. No conversation, no heads up, just motion. I didn't call anyone. I didn't text. I didn't interrupt. Instead, I did something quieter. I downloaded every statement from the last 4 years, every mortgage payment confirmation, every transfer authorization, every timestamp, not as ammunition, as a record. Documentation isn't aggression, it's clarity. As I organized the files, I noticed something else. Every financial move that benefited Evan was discussed emotionally. Every financial move that depended on me was discussed practically. That distinction matters. Emotion generates sympathy. Practicality generates expectation. I had been living inside expectation, and expectation, left unchallenged, becomes permanent. Late that evening, I drove past the house. The lights were on. The living room looked warm through the front windows. Familiar. It looked stable. It looked secure. It looked permanent. And for the first time, I saw it differently. Not as home, not as a sacrifice, not as generosity, as a financial structure, one that could be adjusted. The shift wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about aligning my internal compass with external reality. I no longer felt obligated. I felt aware, and awareness changes behavior slowly at first. Silently, you stop volunteering solutions. You stop smoothing tension. You stop absorbing, not abruptly, just incrementally. That Tuesday didn't end with a confrontation. It ended with a decision forming quietly in the background. If stability was something I provided, it would now be something I controlled. There's a difference. One is passive, the other is intentional. And once that line becomes visible, you can't pretend you don't see it. After that Tuesday, nothing outwardly changed. That was the point. Transformation doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it moves quietly beneath the surface, altering posture before altering action. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't mention the pending transfer. I didn't even cancel it. Instead, I did something unfamiliar. I stopped volunteering. When my father called to ask if I could review a contractor's bid for minor renovations at the house, I responded calmly. I won't be able to look at that this week. There was a pause, not frustration, confusion. You're usually quick with these things, he said. I know, I replied, but I'm focusing on my own priorities right now. The sentence wasn't sharp. It was measured. He accepted it, but I could hear the recalibration in his tone. The assumption of immediate availability had been disrupted. Small, but noticeable. Evan reached out a few days later about a new partnership agreement draft. Can you skim this? He asked over text. Just make sure it's solid. In the past, I would have. Immediately. This time, I responded differently. I recommend you hire a contract attorney. He sent back a laughing emoji. I trust you more. I understand, I said, but you should formalize things properly. It wasn't rejection. It was a boundary. He didn't argue, but he didn't thank me either. Because boundaries feel like withdrawal when someone is accustomed to access. Silence, I began to realize, can be misinterpreted. They mistook it for a distraction, for the workload, for mood. They didn't recognize it as a decision, and that was intentional. I wasn't interested in dramatic correction. I was interested in shifting leverage. I continued paying the mortgage. On time, without announcement. But internally, I was no longer framing it as a duty. I was assessing it as a choice. And choice changes posture. At family dinners, I spoke less about logistics, less about numbers, less about projections. When Evan described another pivot in his business model, I didn't analyze it. I nodded, listened, observed. My mother seemed relieved by that. You're more relaxed lately, she commented one evening. Maybe, I said. What she interpreted as ease was actually detachment, not emotional detachment, structural detachment. I was slowly stepping out of the role of stabilizer, and they didn't see it yet. That's the thing about being dependable. When you withdraw quietly, the absence isn't immediate. It's delayed. Systems take time to feel the loss of invisible support. During that period, I began allocating more of my attention toward my own development. I enrolled in the certification program I had postponed. I met with a financial planner to reassess long-term asset positioning. I opened a separate holding account for strategic liquidity. No one in my family knew. Not because it was secret, because it was no longer communal. Silence became strategic, not punitive, not passive-aggressive, just intentional. They continued operating under the assumption that I was the foundation. What they didn't realize was that foundations can choose where they anchor, and I was gradually unanchoring. The final shift in this phase wasn't visible externally, it happened internally. I stopped asking myself whether I was being fair and started asking whether the structure was. Fairness is emotional, structure is measurable. And once I committed to evaluating the structure, not the sentiment, the next steps became clearer. They still believed I was steady, predictable, absorbing. What they didn't notice was that silence had stopped being compliance. It had become preparation. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine, like organization, like someone quietly getting their affairs in order. That's what I was doing, not in secrecy, in precision. The first thing I did was review the property deed again, not because I doubted it, because I wanted to see it clearly. My name, sole owner. No co-signers, no secondary claims. Legally uncomplicated, emotionally layered. Then I reviewed the mortgage contract, line by line, prepayment penalties, grace periods, default timelines, refinancing clauses, acceleration triggers. Not because I planned to default, because understanding leverage requires knowing the boundaries of consequence. Most people avoid reading contracts that affect them personally. I don't. Clarity reduces fear. It also reduces illusion. I mapped out every payment I had made over the past 4 years. Principal versus interest. Total equity gained. Appreciation trends in the Portland market. Estimated net proceeds under various sales scenarios. The numbers told a story no one had verbalized. The house wasn't just stabilized, it had grown significantly in value, and that growth was entirely tied to a liability I carried alone. Meanwhile, I reviewed the education reserve again. The withdrawals now accounted for nearly 70% of the original balance. Still no written acknowledgement, still no repayment structure, just goodwill. Goodwill is generous. It is not binding. I created a private ledger, not to present, not to threaten, to see mortgage contributions, education reserve transfers, tax payments, maintenance expenses, insurance premiums. I labeled it simply family asset exposure. That title mattered. It reframed everything. This wasn't an emotional sacrifice. It was concentrated exposure. While they saw stability, I saw asymmetry. Around this time, I also scheduled a quiet consultation with a real estate attorney. Not dramatic, not urgent, just informational. What are my options? I asked neutrally. If I wanted to restructure occupancy on a primary residence, titled under my name but occupied by family, he didn't flinch. He laid out possibilities calmly. Lease agreements, equity agreements, sale procedures, tax implications, notice requirements. Nothing emotional, just process. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. I left with no immediate action plan, but with clarity. Clarity is power when you've lived inside an assumption. Meanwhile, my family operated as usual. Evan posted optimistic updates about his ventures online. My parents discussed future renovations casually. They spoke about the house in the future tense. When we redo the kitchen, when we expand the patio, I listened and mentally recalculated ROI on improvements made to an asset legally mine. The shift inside me wasn't cold, it was composed. I wasn't angry at them. I was aware of the imbalance, and awareness requires responsibility. Responsibility to yourself. That's the part no one teaches you. How to withdraw quietly, without collapsing the system prematurely. How to document without accusing. How to prepare without escalating. They didn't notice that I stopped referring to it as home. I started calling it the property. Language changes mindset. Mindset changes outcome. By the end of that month, I had complete financial documentation, legal clarity on ownership rights, a realistic projection of equity under sale, a timeline of exposure if payments continued indefinitely. Nothing explosive, nothing confrontational, just position. Because the moment would come, not a dramatic explosion, a decision point, and when it arrived, I wanted it to be chosen, not triggered. They believed I was still absorbing. What they never noticed was I no longer stabilizing, I was evaluating, and evaluation precedes action. The reveal didn't happen at dinner. It didn't happen during an argument. It happened alone, at my desk, late at night. I had just finished updating the family asset exposure, ledger, mortgage totals, reserve withdrawals, appreciation projections, legal notes from the attorney consultation, numbers, when organized clearly, remove ambiguity. And ambiguity had protected this arrangement for years. I leaned back and looked at the full picture for the first time without emotional framing. If I continued paying the mortgage indefinitely, I would accumulate equity, but also concentrate long-term risk. If I stopped paying abruptly, I would damage my own credit before anyone else felt the consequence. If I sold the property, the equity distribution would be entirely under my legal authority. That last line stayed with me, under my legal authority. For years, I had separated legal ownership from emotional entitlement. Now, I understand that separation was artificial. Ownership is not symbolic. It is structural, and structure governs outcome. That was the private reveal. Not that I had been wronged, but I had leverage. Leverage doesn't mean aggression. It means an option, and the option changes posture. I opened the property valuation tool again and entered conservative sale projections. Even under modest assumptions, the net equity after loan payoff would be substantial. Substantial enough to fully replenish my education reserve, cover transaction costs, redirect capital into diversified assets, all without emotional negotiation. That's when the sentence formed clearly in my mind. Favoritism doesn't override ownership. It wasn't angry. It wasn't rehearsed. It was factual. For years, favoritism had shaped emotional priority, but ownership shaped the legal outcome, and I held that. The second part of the reveal was quieter. I realized I had never explicitly chosen this arrangement long term. I had agreed to stabilize temporarily. Temporary had simply never been revisited. Silence had extended it, which meant I had participated in its continuation. That recognition mattered, because once you acknowledge your participation, you regain agency. I opened my calendar and scrolled backward. 4 years, 48 months of payments, no written review, no renegotiation, no defined endpoint. That wasn't malicious on their part. It was comfortable. Comfort stretches indefinitely unless interrupted. I wasn't angry at my parents. I wasn't angry at Evan, but I was done being undefined. I drafted 3 scenarios in a private document. Formalize occupancy with a lease agreement at market rate. Establish an equity sharing contract with documented contributions. List the property for sale. Each scenario had timelines, notice periods, financial impact analysis, tax considerations. I didn't send the document. I didn't hint at it, but writing it clarified something essential. I was no longer reacting to imbalance. I was choosing from structured alternatives. And choice removes resentment, because resentment thrives in perceived helplessness. Helplessness had disappeared. Around midnight, I closed my laptop. The room was quiet. The city outside was dim and rain-soaked. I didn't feel victorious. I felt aligned. Aligned with my profession. Aligned with my values. Aligned with reality. There would be a moment soon when conversation became necessary. Not explosive. Not theatrical. Just direct. But before that moment, I needed to be certain of something internally. Whatever I chose would not be driven by emotion. It would be driven by structure. Because structure sustains clarity long after emotion fades. And clarity, once reached privately, is irreversible. The conversation didn't happen on a dramatic night. It happened on a Sunday afternoon. Bright, ordinary, quiet. My parents were in the kitchen. Evan was in the living room scrolling through something on his phone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't wait for tension. I simply said, "We need to talk about the property, not the house. The property." They didn't notice the word choice immediately, but tone carries more weight than vocabulary. My mom wiped her hands and sat down. My dad looked mildly concerned. Evan barely looked up. That was familiar. I stayed standing for a moment, not intentionally dominant, just grounded. I've been reviewing the financial structure over the past 4 years. I began. No accusation, just structure. I've covered 100% of the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, and major maintenance since purchase. The education reserve has been drawn down significantly. There has never been a formal agreement defining occupancy, contribution, or timeline. Silence. Evan finally looked up. My dad frowned slightly. My mom spoke first. "We're family. We didn't think we needed contracts." "I agree," I said calmly. At first, that word landed. At first. It reframed everything. This was supposed to be stabilization, temporary. 4 years isn't temporary unless we define it that way. Evan shifted in his seat. "So what are you saying?" he asked. Faze? Not defensive, but alert. "I'm saying we need structure." Then I laid it out clearly. 3 options. Market rate lease agreement starting in 60 days. Documented equity sharing based on contribution moving forward. I list the property for sale within 6 months. No emotion, no raised voice. Just options. Structured, measured, real. My mother's face changed first. Not anger. Realization. "You'd sell it?" she asked quietly. "If the structure remains undefined," I replied. "Yes." My father leaned back. "This feels sudden." "It's not," I said evenly. "It's 4 years overdue." That line reset the room. Evan spoke next. "You're acting like we've been using you." I held his gaze. "I'm acting like ownership has responsibility, and responsibility requires clarity." That was the moment, not dramatic, but pivotal. For the first time, the emotional hierarchy didn't override the financial structure. For the first time, I wasn't the stabilizer. I was the decision maker. Silence stretched. Then something subtle happened. My dad asked, "What would market rent even be?" That question mattered because it acknowledged legitimacy, not guilt. Legitimacy. Evan didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He asked, "And if I contributed toward equity?" Now we were negotiating reality, not assumptions. I didn't push. I didn't demand immediate answers. "I'm giving everyone 30 days to review and decide which structure makes sense," I said. "After that, I'll move forward." Calm, final, not hostile, but irreversible. The conversation ended, not with yelling, but with awareness. And awareness changes power dynamics permanently. That evening, I noticed something subtle. Evan didn't sprawl across the couch the way he usually did. My parents didn't talk about future renovations. The language shifted from assumption for consideration. And that shift, that was the reset. Because once structure enters a system built on imbalance, the system either adapts or dissolves. 30 days passed. No one chose. They delayed. Soft conversations, half-formed suggestions, emotional tones, but no structure, which meant the decision defaulted to me. On day 31, I didn't call a meeting. I emailed a real estate agent. 2, actually. Both came highly recommended in Portland's mid-market residential space. One gave a conservative valuation. The other was more aggressive. Both numbers were higher than my internal projections. Significantly higher. The Portland market had tightened again. Inventory low, demand stable, interest rates had shifted slightly in buyers' favor. The equity wasn't just substantial, it was transformative after loan payoff, taxes, and closing costs. The net proceeds would exceed what I originally paid for the house by a margin large enough to fully replenish the education reserve with growth, fund a diversified investment portfolio, provide a six-figure liquidity cushion, all without debt. I signed the listing agreement quietly. The agent scheduled photography, staging consultation, pre-listing inspection. It moved fast, very fast. The first sign my family noticed wasn't a conversation. It was the photographer setting up tripods in the living room. Evan came downstairs, confused. "What's going on?" "It's being listed," I said evenly. My mom froze in the hallway. My dad looked stunned. "You didn't say you'd decided," he said. "I gave 30 days," I replied. No structure was chosen. There was no anger in my tone, just execution. The house went live on a Thursday. By Sunday, there were 8 offers. The 2 above are asking. 1 cash, no contingencies. That's when the real twist happened. The cash offer came from a regional development group, not a family buyer. They weren't interested in living in it. They were assembling adjacent lots. Zoning changes had recently expanded mixed-use potential in that area. The house wasn't just a residence anymore. It was land leverage. The offer was not just above asking. It was strategically high, high enough to discourage counterbids, high enough to close immediately. When I reviewed the numbers, my hands didn't shake. My breathing didn't change. But internally something shifted. The asset they treated as a permanent shelter had become capital acceleration. I accepted. No escalation clause, no drawn-out negotiation. Clean, immediate, binding. That night, I informed them formally, closing in 30 days. The room felt smaller. My mother cried, not dramatically but quietly. My father sat in silence. Evan paced. "You're uprooting us," he said. "I'm reallocating my capital," I corrected. That sentence ended the debate. Because it wasn't emotional, it was true. The final numbers at closing were even stronger than projected. After everything cleared, I wired funds to restore the education reserve entirely. Then I moved the remaining capital into diversified allocations, broad index funds, short-term treasuries, a minority stake in a private equity vehicle I'd been evaluating for months. I also leased a modern apartment downtown. Smaller, efficient, fully mine. No structural ambiguity. Meanwhile, my family relocated to a rental. Market rate, reality rate. For the first time, the contribution matched occupancy. Evan's tone changed after that. Fewer assumptions, more calculation. He eventually asked about joining one of my portfolio projects. Properly structured. I didn't say yes immediately. I asked for a business plan with projections and risk analysis. He brought one, imperfect, but serious. That was the real twist. Selling the house didn't destroy the family. It recalibrated it, because when capital is redistributed fairly, emotion adjusts. Not instantly, but inevitably. And the biggest realization? I didn't lose a home. I gained leverage, clarity, and boundaries backed by action. The system didn't collapse. It evolved. The house was gone. The funds were reallocated. Life had stabilized into a cleaner configuration. For a while, things were quiet, too quiet. Then one evening, my father asked to meet, not at their rental, not at my apartment, at a small coffee shop halfway between. Neutral ground. He arrived early, which meant it mattered. He didn't start with an accusation. He didn't start with disappointment. He started with a sentence I didn't expect. "You weren't the first one in this family to carry everything." I didn't interrupt. He looked older than usual, not physically, emotionally. Then he told me something I had never known. Before I was born, before Evan, there had been another property, a small commercial space. My father had bought it with his older brother. Joint ownership, no formal structure, family trust. Sound familiar? His brother had struggled financially. My father covered payments, temporarily. then longer, then indefinitely. No written agreement, no contribution recalibration. When the property appreciated, his brother insisted it was shared legacy. When it depreciated, it was your responsibility. Eventually, the business failed. Debt accumulated. My father refinanced in his own name to protect the family. Then the market dipped hard. They lost it. Not just the property, their savings, their liquidity, their stability. He never told me. Because by the time I was old enough to understand finance, he had rebuilt quietly, from scratch, working longer hours, taking less risk, prioritizing safety. That's why he supported me buying the house. But here's the part that shifted everything. You selling it, he said slowly, was the first time I saw someone in this family stop the pattern before it became lost. I didn't expect that. I expected resentment. Instead, there was something like reluctant respect. My mother had known the whole story. She stayed silent for decades, not out of manipulation, out of fear. Fear that financial fracture destroys families. Because for them, it almost did. That's why they avoided contracts, avoided structure, avoided clarity. The structure reminded them of collapse. Whereas to me, structure prevented collapse. Same event, opposite interpretation. Evan didn't know the full story either. He only grew up seeing stability restored, not the damage before. Suddenly, his entitlement looked less malicious, more inherited. We weren't just dealing with favoritism. We were dealing with generational trauma around money. Unspoken, unprocessed, replayed. The pattern was simple. Oversupport the struggling member. Avoid confrontation. Hope appreciation saves everyone. Repeat. Except this time, it didn't repeat. I interrupted it. Not by rebelling, by formalizing. And in doing so, I did something my father couldn't do at my age. I separated love from liability. At the end of the conversation, he said quietly, I was angry at first, but you did what I couldn't. That sentence weighed more than any equity payout because it reframed the sale entirely. It wasn't abandonment. It was a pattern disruption. And sometimes, breaking a pattern looks like betrayal until time reveals it as protection. When I left that coffee shop, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt informed. The story wasn't about favoritism anymore. It was about inherited financial fear, and I had unknowingly forced it into the open. I didn't tell Evan immediately, not because I wanted leverage, but because timing matters when truth rewires identity. He found out a week later, not from me, from Dad. They had argued about rent, not aggressively, but sharply. Evan was frustrated about the rental cost, said it was temporary pressure, said he needed runway. Dad snapped, not loudly, but firmly. I've seen runway turn into ruin, he said. And then he told him everything. The lost property, the refinance, the collapse, the years of rebuilding, the silent fear. Evan showed up at my apartment that night. No announcement, no performance, just knocked. When I opened the door, he didn't look angry. He looked unsettled. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. Because it wasn't my story to tell, I said. We sat down. For the first time in years, he didn't posture, didn't defend, didn't explain away. He just processed. I thought you were being cold, he said quietly, like you were proving something. I was preventing something, I replied. Silence. Then something unexpected happened. He asked for the numbers. Not the emotional recap. The numbers. Mortgage totals. Equity growth. Reserve depletion. Sale net. Portfolio allocation. So I showed him everything. No edits. No dramatics. Just structure. He stared at the spreadsheet longer than I expected. I never saw it like this, he admitted. Because you didn't have to, I said evenly. That wasn't a jab. It was a fact. Then he said something I hadn't anticipated. I don't want to be the reason we repeat that. Not defensive. Not resentful. Aware. That was new. For the first time, he wasn't reacting to losing comfort. He was reacting to inheriting risk patterns. And here's where the shift deepened. He didn't ask me to fund anything. Didn't pitch an idea. Didn't suggest a partnership. He asked, if I wanted to rebuild credibility financially, what would that look like? That question changed the dynamic entirely, because now he wasn't asking for support. He was asking for standards. So I gave them clear metrics, 12 months of documented income stability, debt reduction targets, written business plan with downside modeling, personal liquidity buffer equal to 6 months of expenses, no family clause, no exception clause, just adult criteria. He didn't argue, didn't negotiate. He nodded. I can work with that. And for the first time, I believed he meant it. Not because he was transformed overnight, but because the illusion had been punctured. He saw what Dad almost lost. He saw what I almost carried indefinitely. And he saw that the structure wasn't rejected. It was protection. Over the next few months, small changes appeared. He tracked expenses, cut unnecessary costs, took consulting contracts instead of chasing high-risk launches. Boring moves, stabilizing moves. Dad watched quietly. Mom relaxed slightly. The emotional temperature of the family shifted. Less entitlement, more accountability, not perfect, but measurable. One evening, Evan sent me a revised business model. Conservative, stress-tested. 3 downside scenarios are included. When I reviewed it, I didn't feel pressure. I felt evaluation, which meant the relationship had changed. We weren't operating in favoritism anymore. We were operating in a structure. And structure doesn't eliminate love. It protects it from distortion. The biggest realization? Selling the house wasn't the climax. Revealing the pattern was. Because once a family understands its financial trauma, it can choose differently. And this time, we did. The opportunity didn't come dramatically. It came as an email. Subject line, strategic co-investment inquiry. It wasn't spam. It was from a mid-sized regional development firm, the same group that had bought the house. They weren't contacting me about real estate. They were expanding into mixed-use redevelopment near transit corridors. They had reviewed public transaction records, saw the speed of my close, saw the clean capital structure, saw the reinvestment pattern. They weren't guessing. They were profiling. The email was simple. They were assembling a capital stack for a redevelopment project. They were offering minority participation at preferred terms. Minimum entry threshold, high, 6 figures. I read it twice, then 3 times, because the location caught my attention. It was 2 blocks from where our old property had stood. The land they'd assembled now included it. The house I sold was becoming part of something larger. Higher density, commercial frontage, long-term appreciation play, strategic, calculated. The internal rate of return projections were conservative. The upside case was significant. The risk case was contained, but real. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I forwarded it to Evan. No commentary, just review. He called within 15 minutes. This is real, he said. I know. We met that night. Spreadsheets open. Zoning documents pulled. Market comps analyzed. For the first time in our lives, we were looking at the same numbers from the same side of the table. Not one stabilizing, not one depending. Evaluating together. The required capital commitment was substantial. I could fund it alone, comfortably. But that wasn't the point. The point was alignment. If he wanted credibility, this was the moment to test it. Where are you? I asked him. He showed me his liquidity position. 12 months, income stability met. Debt reduced met. Emergency reserve met. He had done the work, quietly. No announcements, no validation seeking, just execution. He couldn't meet the full threshold alone, but he could contribute meaningfully. Enough to feel the weight, enough to feel risk, enough to feel ownership. We structured it cleanly. Separate capital accounts. Written agreement between us. Profit split, proportional to contribution. Clear exit clauses. No emotional override, just terms. Before signing, he asked one thing. If this goes bad, are we good? I looked at him. We're good if we follow structure. That was the rule now. Not optimism. Not trust based on history. Trust based on clarity. We entered together, minority stakeholders, in a project that would reshape the block where our house once stood. Months passed. Permits approved. Financing locked. Construction began. The early valuation update exceeded projections. Not dramatically, but enough to validate the underwriting. Dad visited the construction site once. Didn't say much, just watched the foundation being poured. Different kind of foundation this time. Not emotional. Structural. Mom asked if it felt strange seeing the old house gone. It didn't, because the house had never been the asset. The decision was, and here's the real shift. For the first time, Evan wasn't protected from risk. He was exposed to it by choice, and he handled it well. No panic when timelines shifted. No blame when costs are adjusted. He stayed analytical, measured, responsible. That mattered more than returns. Because returns fluctuate. Character under risk doesn't. The project is still ongoing, not fully realized, not fully exited, but already profitable on paper. And regardless of the final outcome, the dynamic has permanently changed. We're not repeating the past. We're not avoiding structure. We're not confusing love with liability. We're building with clarity. It started with a notice, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just procedural. A city planning revision, zoning compliance review, triggered by a community petition. The development wasn't canceled, but it was paused indefinitely. Funding tranches were tied to milestone approvals. Milestones were now frozen, which meant capital sat exposed. Carrying costs accumulated. Interest ticked quietly. Paper gains disappeared overnight. The valuation update reversed. Not lost yet, but pressure. The development firm called an emergency investor meeting, revised projections, extended timelines, higher contingency requirements, additional capital call likely. That word changed everything. Capital call, meaning contribute more or dilute. I could meet it. It would be uncomfortable but manageable. Evan, he would be stretched, not bankrupt, but tested. After the meeting, we walked in silence for a while. Finally, he said, "This is the part people don't show in success stories." He wasn't panicking, but I could feel the calculation behind his eyes. Exposure, liquidity, risk, concentration. He did the math aloud. If I meet the capital call, my buffer drops below 6 months. That breaks your own rule, I said. I know. There it was. The tension point. Structure versus loyalty. Opportunity versus prudence. History versus evolution. Dad called later that night. He had heard from one of the other minority investors. His voice carried old echoes. "Don't overextend to save face," he said quietly. That sentence carried generational weight. I asked Evan to come over. No spreadsheets this time, just clarity. "We don't protect the investment," I said. "We protect the structure." He exhaled slowly. "If we don't meet it fully, we dilute." "Yes." "And if we do?" "You compress your safety margin." He nodded. Then something shifted in his tone. "What if we split it differently?" I looked at him. He continued, "You take the larger share of the capital call. I accept proportional dilution. We amend our internal agreement accordingly." That was not the old Evan. Old Evan would have asked me to carry it temporarily. New Evan proposed a shared consequence. Transparent adjustment. No emotional pressure. Just recalibration. I considered it carefully. It preserved his liquidity. It preserved my structure. It preserved alignment. It is accepted that contribution equals ownership. We amended the agreement, signed digitally that night. Clear, clean, no resentment. When the capital call was officially triggered, we executed immediately. No hesitation, no scrambling. The development firm later confirmed that several minority investors defaulted. Forced dilution, forced exit. We didn't. Months passed. The zoning issue was resolved more slowly than expected, but it resolved. The pause became a restart. Restart became momentum. The revised projections were lower than the original, but stable, more conservative, less speculative, ironically stronger. One evening, Evan said something I didn't expect. If this had happened 2 years ago, I would have blamed you. I didn't respond immediately. Now? I asked. Now I see it as the cost of admission. That's when I knew the pattern was truly broken. Not because the investment survived, but because his mindset did. The project will eventually exit. Maybe strong, maybe modest. That's secondary. What matters is this. We faced pressure without collapsing into old roles. No savior, no dependent, no silent resentment, just structure under stress. And when structure holds under stress, it becomes trust, not emotional trust, earned trust, the kind that compounds. The project eventually exited, not explosively, not disastrously, respectably, solid multiple, moderate IRR, clean distribution, no headlines, no dramatic wealth event, just outcome. When the funds hit, I didn't celebrate. I updated allocations, rebalanced exposure, moved a portion into long-term index positions, allocated some into municipal bonds. Evan paid himself modestly, rebuilt his liquidity buffer immediately, reinvested conservatively. No lifestyle spike, no impulsive scaling. That restraint meant more than the return. A week later, we had dinner, all of us. Not at the rental, not at my apartment, at a small restaurant halfway between. Neutral ground again. Dad seemed lighter, not because of the money, because the pattern hadn't repeated. Mom talked about future plans calmly, not renovation fantasies, not dependency, just normal life. At one point, Evan raised his glass. To structure, he said. We laughed. But it wasn't a joke. Structure had become our family language, not contracts in a cold sense, but clarity in expectation, ownership defined, contribution aligned, risk acknowledged. For the first time in our lives, money wasn't emotional leverage. It wasn't silent guilt. It wasn't favoritism disguised as love. It was simply capital, a tool. Later that night, I walked alone, past the block where the old house once stood. The redevelopment is now. Lights on. Ground floor retail is active. Apartments above. It no longer resembled what we had, but it didn't need to. The house had never been the lesson. The imbalance was. Selling it wasn't a loss. It was an interruption. And the interruption allowed redesign. I realized something then. Financial maturity isn't about maximizing return. It's about minimizing distortion. Distortion between love and liability, support and sacrifice, trust and assumption. We still argue sometimes. We still disagree. But now, disagreement has boundaries. Boundaries backed by terms. Terms backed by respect. And respect backed by shared exposure. That's what remained, not wealth, not property, not even the investment. What remained was this. We no longer confuse care with coverage. We no longer inherit fear without examining it. We no longer stabilize at the cost of silence. And in that quiet shift, the family became stronger than any house ever made it. If you ever want to build another arc, different industry, different family, different conflict, we can start again. Structure first.